Okay, well, thanks very much, Herman, and thanks for organising this. It's great to be here. Um, this is a joint work with our ANU student Vincent, who's sitting here. So thank you, Vincent. And the subtitle has changed, but not in any serious way. It's not a case of it's not too egregious a case of false advertising. Anyway, let's see. So sorry. Okay, so what are the attitudes to the question, can LLMs think? Well, there's yes, no, and not yet. So yes, that's how we routinely describe them. That's how we routinely interpret them. We should take that at face value. No, they behave as if they think within limits, but they're not doing the real thing. And then the third answer, which I guess is defended by Dave Chalmers, says, well, not yet. While the systems that are currently available don't think, systems of this kind will be able to think, or at least it's reasonable to suppose that they'll think. Systems of this general kind will be able to think at some point in the reasonably near future. Okay, so I am sort of innately in the no camp. That's how I sort of was brought up, more or less. I think it can't be the case that they think. But I do concede that it's one thing to say that, and it's quite another thing to provide a convincing argument for that conclusion. So what I thought I would do today is to set out 3 arguments for the negative answer and compare and contrast them. So it's a fairly modest project for the paper. What are the 3 arguments? The 3 arguments I'm going to look at is first what I'll refer to as the blockhead argument, which is basically the idea that Ned Block's famous thought experiment gives us a reason, or can be thought of in such a way as to give us a reason that LLMs don't think. The second argument is probably the most famous argument in this sort of literature, what I call the form and meaning argument. That's the Bender and Kohler argument, or perhaps the octopus argument. And that argument says that LLMs are, as they say, stochastic parrots trained only on form. And the third argument is one that Vincent and I have been trying to develop a bit, called, we think of it as an argument from rationality, or a rationality argument, which tries to leverage considerations about rationality to show that LLMs don't think. So what I want to do is just contrast these arguments. So first, let me just make a few preliminaries just to set things aside and to set a few things up. So first of all, I'm interested in the question of whether LLMs can think in general, which means I'm kind of in the cognitive capacities rather than linguistic capacities aspect of the topic of the conference. And by that, I mean roughly whether they can believe, whether they can reason, that kind of issue. I'm not at all interested in the question of whether they're conscious, which is a separate issue from my point of view. Secondly, I'm kind of interested in it from a philosophy of mind point of view, not so much a philosophy of language point of view. So what I'm basically assuming is that the class of things that think have some property in common, perhaps a very complex property or a very abstract property, but nevertheless, they have a property in common, and the question is whether LLMs have that property. Thirdly, there's obviously a range. We're talking about computation here, so there's a range of metaphysical questions about the nature of computation, the relation between mathematical structures and the physical world, things of that sort. I'm not going to discuss that today. I'm also not going to summarize the way LLMs work. Most of you know vastly more about that than I do, so I'm not going to worry about that. Fifthly, there's a range, obviously, of moral and social and political issues about LLMs, which seem to me to arise regardless of whether they can think. So I'm going to set that aside as well. And then finally, there's the question of, suppose they can't think, suppose you're in the no camp. What are they? What sort of positive account could we give of them? I'm kind of attracted to what Lederman and Marwold call the bibliotechnist hypothesis, which is roughly that they're an interesting kind of cultural technology. I was kind of hoping we could discuss that a little bit. Perhaps we're not going to discuss it as much as I thought. But in any case, I won't talk about that in the paper either. Okay, so let's turn then to the three arguments I wanted to look at. So the first is the blockhead argument. And a good way, I think, into this argument is to consider this passage from a recent paper by Millier and Buchner, which is a paper which sort of sets out in a very, very helpful way a whole range of kind of philosophy of mind-ish topics surrounding LLM. And here's what they say. To philosophers who've been thinking about artificial intelligence for many years, GPT-4 can seem like a thought experiment come to life, albeit one that calls into question the link between intelligence and behavior. As early as 1981, Ned Block imagined a hypothetical system, today commonly called blockhead, that exhibited behaviors indistinguishable from adult humans, yet was not considered intelligent. Block's challenge focused on the way in which the system produced its responses to inputs. In particular, Blockhead's responses were imagined to have been explicitly pre-programmed by a very large and clever team of human researchers working for a very long time with a very large grant and a lot of mechanical help to devise optimal answers to any potential question that the judge might ask. In other words, Blockhead answers questions not by understanding the inputs and processing them flexibly and efficiently, but rather simply retrieving and regurgitating the answers from its gargantuan memory, like a lookup operation in a hash table. The consensus among philosophers is that such a system would not qualify as intelligent. For people like me who like to emphasize agreement in philosophy, I particularly like the last sentence. The consensus among philosophers is that such a system would not qualify as intelligent. Now, the passage is interesting from us from a number of points of view. One is it sort of gives us sort of a summary of what the blockhead case is. We have this machine which is built to be behaviorally equivalent to, in the original paper, to Ned Block's Aunt Bubbles. Aunt Bubbles is supposed to be an ordinary cognitive agent. And we have a machine that is that duplicates entirely the behavior of Aunt Bubbles, at least from inputs and outputs point of view, and is also disposed to behave exactly as Aunt Bubbles does. But the internal processing is completely different. It's done by a massive lookup table that's kind of pre-programmed into the system. And as Block says, the machine has, as he says, the intelligence of a toaster. It's not supposed to have any kind of thinking or believing or reasoning at all. But nevertheless, it duplicates in perfect ways the behavior of an ordinary agent. Okay, so that's interesting, but in what sense does that tell us something about LLMs, you might ask? In what sense is it a thought experiment come to life? And while the Millier and Buchner paper is very helpful, they're a little bit thin on the question of how to go from this case to the conclusion we're looking for, which is that LLMs don't think, how to construct the argument. And they speak a lot about a sort of skeptical challenge, but it isn't particularly clear. Well, one way to formulate the argument, a very, very simple way, is just to think of it like this. Premise one, LLMs are blockheads. That's to think of the thought experiment come to life, just that they just are such machines. Premise two, blockheads don't think. Conclusion, LLMs don't think. Well, the second premise seems reasonably okay, that in fact you might think is the consensus view. It's true that the consensus view is often formulated in terms of intelligence. I won't worry particularly about the difference between intelligence and thinking. Today, we can just think of that as the same kind of property. That is a property that blockheads don't have. But since LLMs are blockheads, according to the argument, we get the conclusion that LLMs don't think. The problem is that the first premise is very implausible. And the reason that the first premise is very implausible is, for one thing, the architecture of Blockhead is completely different from the architecture of LLMs. They're very different kinds of machines. The whole point about Blockhead is that you have these sort of pre-programmed set of rules that duplicates the behavior of a particular person, but that obviously isn't true in the case of LLMs. Moreover, as Millier and Buchner point out, it's a sort of an open question what the internal processing is in LLMs. Maybe it takes a very sophisticated form too, different perhaps from blockhead. So there doesn't seem to be any particular reason to endorse that first premise. Okay, so I think that first pass version of the argument isn't very plausible because it presupposes this idea that LLMs are blockheads, that they are the thought experiment come to life. But actually that doesn't seem terribly plausible. But I think we can get a slightly better version of the blockhead argument if we back up a bit and think a bit harder about what it is that the blockhead argument was trying to refute in the first place. Well, actually in the paper, what Bloch says is that what he's trying to do is refute what he calls the neo-Turing test conception of intelligence. And that gives you an analysis something like this. X is intelligent just in case X passes, or perhaps X is disposed to pass the Turing test. And the point of this is that the blockhead will satisfy the right-hand side. It will be true of a blockhead that it passes or is disposed to pass the Turing test just as much as any ordinary agent, but it isn't intelligent. It has the intelligence of a toaster. So you get a kind of refutation of a theory of that kind. But if the blockhead was limited to just refuting that conception of intelligence, it wouldn't be so interesting. It would be interesting, but perhaps not so interesting, because that conception of intelligence defined in terms of the Turing test, for many of us, think has sort of historical interest, perhaps not terribly, it's not really a substantive proposal. Why should we define intelligence in terms of the action of a particular judge that's involved in a Turing test? But one of the things that's happened in philosophy of mind since the appearance of this is the idea that blockhead is expanded and expanded in the following sense. There's a whole class of theories in philosophy of mind that blockhead refutes independently of the Turing test view of intelligence. And so here are three proposals which blockhead is sort of standardly taken to refute. One proposal is sometimes called supervenient behaviorism, which has a sort of curious role in philosophy of mind. It's a thesis which nobody seems to hold, but nevertheless is sort of theoretically quite interesting. It says basically two systems that are identical in respect of dispositions to behave are psychologically identical. Obviously, blockhead would refute that because Aunt Bubbles and Aunt Bubbles' blockhead duplicate will have the same dispositions to behave that will be psychologically very different. Perhaps a bit more interesting is that it would also refute certain simplified versions of functionalism, usually thought of as the sort of inheritor theory to behaviorism. And an obvious one is what's sometimes called input-output functionalism, which basically says that you believe something, that you believe some proposition just in case you're in some state or other that occupies a sort of limited functional role, and likewise for other sorts of states, not just belief. This theory is somewhat limited in two kinds of ways. First of all, it places no constraints on the kind of state you have to be in. And secondly, it limits the functional role in a particular way. It basically says anything that mediates between certain kinds of input-outputs will count as a belief. And the thought is that that theory, if blockhead really has the intelligence of a toaster, it can't, that input-output functionalism can't be true, because obviously blockhead has states which play that sort of functional role. So it would refute also input-output functionalism. Thirdly is the kind of proposal that's associated often with Dennett and perhaps with Davidson, sometimes called interpretationism, which says that you believe that P just in case your behavior is predictable on the assumption that you believe that P, something of that sort. And that theory, blockhead would refute that theory too, because obviously your blockhead duplicate is predictable on the assumption that it believes that P, even though it doesn't believe that P. So we have all of these theories which blockhead puts pressure on. So what's the lesson? Well, the lesson is that to believe something requires some sort of fairly rich internal structure that is at least akin to that present in exemplars of thinkers, that is, us, roughly, or perhaps us and animals. That's what all of those theories don't tell you. They don't say anything about that you require any kind of internal structure. Whereas that's typically thought of in philosophy of mind as the lesson of blockhead. So if it is really true, as Millier and Buchner say, that it's the consensus position that we accept blockhead, that's pretty much what we've accepted. There are various ways to accommodate that point. One way is to adopt what's sometimes called empirical functionalism, which says something like you believe that P just in case you're in a natural state of a specific sort. So here we're restricting attention to particular kinds of states. And we say something like you're in that state, which as a matter of fact occupies some relevant functional role, but needn't. And then if you have a theory like that, you leave it as an open empirical question, maybe to be answered by cognitive or neural science, or perhaps by some other science, as to what exactly the nature and structure of that state is, exactly what, if you like, what the essence of belief is. So from this point of view, kind of belief has some sort of empirical essence, which science will tell us about. But as far as this part of philosophy goes, all you're really saying is that you believe something just in case you're in a state of that kind, which has internal structure. Okay, so what has all this got to do with LLMs, you might ask? Well, the reason I went through this is because we can construct a second argument against, for the view that LLMs don't think, perhaps something like this. Premise one, if a system thinks, it must have the relevant kind of internal structure. Premise two, LLMs do not have that kind of internal structure, or at any rate, it's unknown whether they do. And from this, we get the conclusion that LLMs don't think, or at any rate, it's unknown whether they do. We can't, in fact, assert in the situation that they think. So why do we get these premises? Well, the first premise is motivated by the blockhead case. That's what the blockhead case tells us. It basically tells us that if you think, you must have some relevant kind of internal structure. It doesn't say what kind it is, but it has to be of some kind. And secondly, the second premise is motivated basically, the second premise is motivated by following kinds of considerations. First of all, as everybody points out, LLMs are clearly doing something very different from us because they have access to huge amounts of data, which we don't have access to. Secondly, we, after all, don't know exactly what we are doing in the following sense. The whole point of empirical functionalism is to leave it as an open question what the essence of belief is, what the nature of belief is. That's something to be discovered. Nobody thinks that right now we know exactly what it is, so we don't know exactly whether these systems are doing what we're doing. And then thirdly, there's the point that we don't know exactly what these systems are doing. That's another common remark about LLMs. So generally speaking, we're sort of in the dark about what the nature of the states have to be in order that you think. And we can't exactly say that LLMs have that. We know that there must be something that you need. That's the lesson of the blockhead case. We know it has some sort of rich structure, but we don't exactly know what it is, and we don't know whether these things have them. Now, the conclusion of this argument isn't quite that they don't think, but it's pretty close because we can't exactly assert that they think because we don't know that they do. Okay, so I think what's the problem with this argument? Well, a kind of an obvious potential weakness with this argument is a kind of anthropocentrism. And that's because it looks awfully as if on this kind of picture, you only think if you do it in the human way, because you have to have whatever it is, whatever is the natural property that we exemplars of thought have in order to think. And so the question, it's a kind of, since it's an open question, whether LLMs have that property, and you might think it's actually somewhat unlikely that they have that property, then it's an open question, perhaps somewhat unlikely that they think. But you might sort of start worrying about aliens, you know, at this point and think, well, maybe it's not actually required that we have these specific properties. I kind of go back and forth a bit on this. Some days I think this doesn't really matter because maybe this internal structure could be understood in an abstract enough way that, you know, even aliens could have it. Other times I think this is bad. But in any case, if we're out for looking for, what we're really looking for is a kind of convincing argument, I think this is going to be a problem for this type of argument. Okay, so that's really what I want to say about the blockhead case. It's sort of, the first version I think is implausible. The second version is much more plausible, but it does run into this kind of worry. Okay, let me look then at the next argument I want to consider, which is the Bender and Kohler argument. Now, the Bender and Kohler argument, I think, the basic idea at the heart of this argument, as I understand it, is this idea that meaning can't be learned from linguistic form alone. You can't you can't somehow know something about meaning just on the basis of linguistic form. What do they mean by form? They mean any observable realization of language, marks on a page, pixels or bytes in a digital representation of text, or movements of the articulators. So in voiced subjects, that's movements of the larynx, for example, or in signers, it's movements of the hands or the fingers. And what's meaning for this purpose in the paper, meaning is some sort of relation that obtains between an expression and a communicative intention that an agent may have in using that expression. Okay, that I mean by meaning in this kind of context. And so you can think of them as endorsing what you might call a kind of insufficiency thesis. And the insufficiency thesis is that it's possible for a subject to know everything about the form, in their sense of form, of a set of expressions and not know about the meaning of those expressions. And perhaps more generally, that information about form is not sufficient for information about meaning. So that's a kind of insufficiency thesis. But again, we could ask, okay, suppose that's true, or suppose just provisionally it's true, how do we get from that to the desired conclusion? In other words, how do we go from that to the claim that LLMs don't think? Well, so far as I can see, the argument in their paper takes something like this form. The first premise is just the insufficiency thesis. It says information about form is not sufficient for information about meaning. And the second premise is that LLMs are trained only on form, or perhaps are only sensitive to form in their sense. And from this, we get the conclusion that LLMs do not respond to meaning, and so, in their case, do not understand a language. Now, on the face of it, I think good things about this argument is that both premises are kind of plausible. It is kind of plausible, given the way that the notion of form and meaning are understood here, that information about form is not by itself sufficient for information about meaning. No amount of information about the form of a bunch of expressions will allow you to draw conclusions about the meaning. That seems plausible. Likewise, it seems plausible that LLMs are trained only on form. And so we get a conclusion which isn't quite the same as the claim that LLMs don't think, but it's pretty close. Partly because to understand a language is to think in a particular way. You have to know that this expression has this meaning, for example. Moreover, you might think that while it's, of course, it's possible to think without having a language, that's not going to be the case for LLMs. For them, those properties go together. So let's assume that from this conclusion, we can get to the conclusion that LLMs don't think. Okay, so what could we say about this argument? Well, I think there are sort of two basic problems with this argument. The first problem is that the premises don't entail the conclusion. The premises don't entail the conclusion. And one way to see that is to assume, for the sake of argument, that there's some sort of empirical, stable connection between form and meaning, which there could be. There could be just some stable connection between an expression's having a certain form and an expression's having a certain meaning. And if that's true, if we go back, then it could perfectly be possible that the two premises are true and the conclusion isn't true. Because the first premise is it's a sort of premise that we're sort of familiar with in philosophy. It's a premise that says information of this kind is not sufficient even in principle for information of this other kind. That can be true, and while it's at the same time, there are sort of nomological correlations between the two categories of thing that we're talking about. And if that's true and LLMs are trained only on form, it may be that the case that they also respond to meaning in any natural sense. So that the argument seems to me to be invalid in an important sense, and that means it's not persuasive. So that's the first objection to the argument, I think, that it just doesn't give us that conclusion because it's invalid. I think there's another objection to the argument, and that is it kind of overshoots. And that's because what we're looking for is an argument that LLMs don't think. But we're not really looking for an argument that artificial general intelligence is impossible or something of that kind. We're talking about systems that have particular kinds of architectures and are wondering whether they think. But we're not talking about whether it's in principle possible or not to have, to construct artificial intelligence. And in fact, in the history of this is quite interesting because the blockhead argument was supposed to be an argument that showed something about, in that case, the Turing test, but it wasn't supposed to rule out artificial intelligence in general. In that sense, for example, it's quite different from the Searle argument, the Chinese room argument, which is supposed to show that artificial intelligence is in general impossible. That wasn't the case of the blockhead argument. So far as I can see, though, this argument is rather like the Searle argument in that respect. In fact, you might ask whether it's any different from the Searle argument. But in any case, it has this problem that it sort of overshoots. We don't want an argument that rules out this entire possibility. Again, the blockhead argument doesn't do that. The blockhead argument tells us that in order to think or to be intelligent, we have to have some sort of rich internal structure, but it doesn't tell us that you couldn't replicate that structure in an artificial system. Whereas this sort of line of thought suggests that perhaps you couldn't do it, at least you couldn't do it in general. Sorry, why do I say this? Why does it overshoot? The main reason is that the second premise, LLMs are trained only on form, is plausibly true of any kind of computer or any kind of computational process. So if you think that's true of any kind of computational process, then it looks as if we'd have an argument that no such thing could possibly think. Okay. So let me now turn to the third argument I want to consider, which is this rationality argument. And there are sort of two leading ideas in this particular argument. And the first idea has to do with what it is to be rational. So we're thinking that to be rational is to respond correctly to your evidence. Maybe that's not sufficient for being rational, but maybe that's necessary. And the general idea is that given that LLMs think, they mostly fail to do that. They mostly fail to respond correctly to their evidence. And if that's true, then by that standard at least, they're not rational. So the basic idea is that if they think, they fail a necessary condition on being rational. And the second idea, which is reasonably common in philosophy of mind in various forms, is that thinkers are by their nature rational. Sometimes this idea comes in a kind of florid form where it's like it's metaphysically necessary that thinkers are rational, or sort of analytic or something that thinkers are rational. But you could imagine a weaker version that says, well, perhaps just by nomological or empirical necessity, thinkers are rational. Okay. To be rational doesn't mean that you always respond appropriately to your evidence, obviously, but it means that you mostly do. And with these two ideas, you can construct an argument like this that has something like this form. Premise one, if LLMs think they're not rational. Premise two, if LLMs think they are rational, and so LLMs don't think. So both premises are conditional so that you can assert them both without worrying about believing the antecedent. But we could agree that they're both true, and then they'll give us that conclusion. Okay, so why believe the premises of this argument? Why believe the premises of this argument? Well, the reason for premise one, I think, can be brought out in the following kind of way. So suppose you have an LLM, and suppose that you offer some prompt, like where do the best bananas grow, and it comes out with the sentence, the best bananas grow in the tropics. Now, in that kind of situation, if we're inclined to attribute a belief to the LLM, we'd think, well, okay, it has some real world belief. Which belief? Well, the natural assumption is that it has the belief that the best bananas grow in the tropics. After all, that's the proposition that's conventionally expressed by that sentence. So you'd think, okay, it believes that proposition. But now we can ask the question, well, what evidence does it have for that belief, assuming provisionally that it has that belief? What's the evidence that it has for that belief? Well, since people don't have direct insight into matters of this kind, and LLMs don't have direct insight into matters of this kind either. It must be that it inferred this belief from something else that it believes, which constitute its evidence, whatever it is. So that means that there must be some proposition, called it Q, which the thing believes and from which it inferred the belief that the best bananas grow in the tropics. That's just a matter of its having evidence. Then the question is, what is Q? Well, the basic thought here is that given the nature of LLMs, you might think that Q just has to be a proposition that concerns the distribution of words in some huge body of text. We don't exactly know what it is, but we can say that it's a proposition that's true if and only if some bunch of words are distributed in a particular way in this text. But why do I say that? Because that's how we know that the system arrived at this belief. That's how we know it got to the state where it said to us, the best bananas grow in the tropics. It got to this on the basis of information about words. But of course, propositions about words, propositions about the word bananas in some huge body of text, about the distribution of that word or a lot of other words, do not by themselves give you propositions about bananas, not by themselves. And more generally, propositions about words don't by themselves confirm propositions about the world. They don't give you that kind of evidence. And so in this particular case, if the LLM had this belief about bananas and it arrived at that belief because of some other belief about words, then it didn't respond appropriately to its evidence. It went beyond what its evidence would suggest. Again, the point here isn't that it couldn't possibly believe proposition Q. We're assuming that it has beliefs for the sake of argument. We're just saying that if it has a bunch of beliefs about bananas and it got to it from this proposition Q, and Q is about words, then it didn't respond appropriately to its evidence. And moreover, that's typical, you might think, of the inferences that such systems perform. And if that's true, then we arrive at premise one. Premise one was, if it thinks, then it's not rational. Why is that? Because if it thinks, then it doesn't respond correctly to its evidence. Its evidence is basically about words, but if it thinks, especially if it thinks about bananas, it goes beyond its evidence. So premise one is true. What about premise two? Well, as I mentioned, the fundamental idea is that thinkers are rational, at least in an empirical sense. There's a quotation from Elizabeth Camp that I like that kind of captures this. Clearly, we should agree, she says, that a measure of active rationality is necessary for thinking of any sort. A creature who systematically refused to revise its beliefs in the light of overwhelming countervailing evidence would arguably be too irrational to count as thinking at all. One reason I like this quotation is because I think Camp is reasonably clear that the modalities here are supposed to be natural and empirical rather than metaphysical or conceptual, which I think is sufficient for this purpose. So if that's the case, then premise one is true. We can certainly discuss further whether that's true, but if it's true, then LLMs think they're irrational. It's just part of thinking that you're rational, but it's also true that part of thinking of this particular sort means that you're not. Okay, so let me finish with some objections to this idea. So first of all, you might think, well, shouldn't we interpret the LLM's conclusion belief or beliefs as about words too? And what I mean here is that we assumed, given the sentence that came out of the LLM, that it had the belief about bananas, but maybe it just has some belief about words, not about bananas. The mere fact that it came out with a particular sentence doesn't clinch that fact, because we're talking not about the meaning of the sentence that it produced, but the belief that it's in. And it's an open question as to what the nature of that belief is, what the content of that belief is. And one possibility is that it too is a belief about words. And if you thought it was a belief about words, no matter how we would intuitively describe it, then we lose any claim that that it hasn't responded correctly to its evidence. Because if you interpret it that way, then basically all that's happened is that it has a premise about words and it comes to a conclusion about words. No problem if you interpret it that way. I think one could do that. And so a feature of this particular argument is that it doesn't actually rule out the possibility that LLMs think. What it does is, because it's perfectly possible that they think, but only about words. So they're just weird agents that think only about words. They move from premises to conclusions about words and never about extra-linguistic realities. So that's a feature of this argument, that it doesn't actually, it's unlike the first two arguments that I mentioned, which are actually more ambitious. This one only tells you that it doesn't actually rule out the possibility that they think. It only says they couldn't be thinkers about the world. Still, you might think the view that that they think but only about words is an extremely deflationary thing to think in this context. And so maybe it's okay for people like me who are in the no camp about whether LLMs can think, because when people think that they don't mean do they think just about words, they mean do they think about bananas and other sorts of pieces of extra linguistic reality. And so I think that this objection, while right, could be one could concede it without conceding everything, I think. What about another objection? Well, another objection is the sort of mirror image of the first one. And it says, well, what about the premise? The premise, I said, was a belief about words. But maybe we could interpret the premise as a belief about the world as well, in which case we'd be back again. But here I want to lean on the idea that about how the systems are designed. We all agree that they're designed to respond to huge amounts of text in certain kinds of ways. It seems plausible to say that that is the information that they're dealing with. And if you allow that to inform your judgments about what beliefs they have, then it seems plausible to think that the premise belief is in fact about words. And moreover, I think even if in a certain particular case, if you thought, okay, we could interpret it as about the world, something of this general category is going to be true somewhere along the line. Somewhere along the line, there has to be this jump from belief about words to belief about the world. And if that's the case, we get the argument, I think, back again. Finally, you might think there's something funny about the argument because I'm looking at the LLM's premise and conclusion beliefs and interpreting them in a way that violates a kind of plausible uniformity constraint on interpretation. You might think, well, either they're both about words or both about the world. But in this particular case, I've said, okay, the premise is about words, but the conclusion is about the world. That seems odd. Why is this shift in subject matter? Why is there this big change? And I think that in general, it's plausible that we should aim for uniformity when we interpret people or when we attribute beliefs to them. But of course, that uniformity can't be applied mechanically, because we know, after all, that people make use-mention confusions. They go from premises about words to conclusions about the world. That's what a use-mention confusion is. And what we've basically said is that LLMs are doing that too. And that's why they're not rational. And so we can't use some uniformity constraint on interpretation to rule that out a priori, I think. Okay, so let me just summarize. So first of all, what the goal has been to assess and compare three arguments for the thesis that LLMs don't think. The first argument, the blockhead argument, the first pass of the blockhead argument, I think, is implausible because it assumes as a premise that LLMs are blockheads, and that just does not seem to be true. The second argument, which didn't assume that, but said something like, well, what we learn from the blockhead case is that it's actually rather demanding to think, to have beliefs. You have to have a relevant kind of internal structure, and we don't know whether LLMs have that structure. We don't even know what that structure is in our own case. I think that's better, but as I said, it runs into anthropocentrism worries. Not sure how strong a point that is, but that's certainly a worry if we're looking for a dialectically convincing argument. The form and meaning argument, which is the Bender and Kohler argument, I think suffers on two grounds. It's kind of invalid. It just doesn't get to the conclusion. And secondly, it overshoots insofar as it tells us something about AGI in general. So then the rationality argument looks better than those, But as I said, it does have some problems as well. For one thing, it doesn't rule out the idea that LLMs think entirely, and it also faces some of these issues of interpretation that I was just talking about. Okay, so that's the paper. So look forward to what you have to say.